Get ready before life happens. The podcast helping you navigate life's what ifs.
Welcome to Get Ready Before Life Happens. I'm your host, Tony Stewart. Today, I'm joined by Chris Olofson, founder of DIVEE Financial. Chris, welcome. Great to have you here today.
Thank you. Nice being here.
Yeah, so excited to jump into this conversation with you. I think you've got some really useful information. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your origin story and how did it lead you to launch DIVEE?
My origin story is I was a financial professional for my entire career. And a few years back, right at the start of the pandemic, my sister went through a very unexpected late life divorce. She had been with her husband for 35 years and they were married like 30 or 31 years. In fact, had just celebrated. And up comes the divorce. And I found myself really helpless. She was in Utah, and I just found myself really helpless out here in California. So anyway, what ended up happening is she included me in all her conversations with her lawyer. They had lived in Texas, which was a community property state. And if you had kids over 18, there was no spousal support in the state of Texas. And so anyway, she had raised the kids, not worked, helped her husband build his career as a lawyer, I might add. And we were really outmatched. And so they had a ski home and were planning to retire in the state of Utah. And so I said, I wonder what the divorce laws are in the state of Utah. Well, it turns out it is not a community property state. It is what they call an equitable distribution state. So you don't divide the assets 50-50, you divide them, fairly or equitably. But they recognize spousal support and they recognize the role of a spouse that stays at home to, help build the family finances and the other person's career. So anyway, we decided to file. She established residency, registered her car, registered to vote, established residency for 3 months in the state of Utah, and then we filed for the divorce. And so then spousal support was in the mix, and she ended up getting it for almost 10 years. And from that process, I enjoyed it so much. I helped her forensic accountant divide the assets and cherry pick which assets worked for her better. And I enjoyed it so much that I thought, I wonder if there's a business here. And she kept encouraging me, you should do this for other people, Chris. You helped me so much. You should do this for other people. So in speaking with the lawyer, she said there is a CDFA designation, which stands for Certified Divorce Financial Analyst. And because I'm a CPA, I could fast track my entrance into that. So all I had to do was take a 10-week course and a 4-hour exam. And the requirements were a little more stringent for people who don't have a CPA background or a CFP background. But anyway, so I became a CDFA 5 years ago, and I've been doing this business ever since.
Well, that's awesome. So, I want to go back to something because you mentioned, that your sister was, a stay-at-home mom or, whatever the term would be, but yet she's still contributing financially. And so you mentioned jurisdiction. So, I have listeners, all over the country, a few listeners around the world. What are some, I guess, more high level concepts that people can think about when they're thinking about, going through the divorce process if their jurisdiction doesn't provide spousal allowance?
Well, we got lucky because they had already owned property in Utah, which was an equitable distribution state. So I don't know if that made residency a little bit easier, but I know she only had to do those two things, which was to register to vote and to register her car. However, I think the big things you want to think about is if spousal support is something that you're going to rely on, and if it even exists in the state that you are divorcing, because it's spousal support is not a given anymore. There's about 14 factors in California that help decide spousal support. And at the end of the day, it's a judge that makes that decision. So spousal support has gone from being, a component of every divorce to being much more rehabilitative in nature. So you don't get to just sit and not work after divorce. I mean, many states expect you to go back to work, get on your feet, and the spousal support instead of half the year's marriage, with so many people think, oh, I get spousal support for half the years we've been married. That's sometimes a starting point, but most of the time in most states, spousal support is considered rehabilitative, and it's meant to help you get on your feet to then provide for yourself.
So just to give you enough time to get things together, because if somebody's been
Correct.
out of the workforce, and I know this is a huge issue for women, is we know that across the country and probably across the world, women are the ones who usually stay at home to take care of the kids, and they sacrifice a lot of their career, so they're behind. And there's already the gender pay gap, so women
Mm-hmm.
are a little bit further behind of that, and
Yes.
then women are out of the workforce. So, is there anything that women can do to, I don't know, protect themselves is not quite the right word, but to make sure their situation is as best as it can be if they make the choice to stay home and take care of the kids?
Yeah. So I have a case right now, actually, where you have to just be careful of what assets you're selecting. For example, I have a case right now where my client is really wanting this vacation home that they have in Palm Springs. And she might want to generate income renting it out, but there are all sorts of laws against that. You have to have a 1 month rental. But for example, she wants this home and she's not working. So right now she can really enjoy the home. However, if she is being made to work, she will not have the time to enjoy that home. She will not be able to drive down there and spend 3 weeks at a time and 2 weeks at a time if she's working full time. And the career path that she's seeking is a full-time non-remote position. So you need to really think about what your requirements are going to be post-divorce. So, we're being careful whether or not she's going to truly want that asset if she's going to be made to work and doesn't obtain spousal support to allow her to enjoy that asset. So that's just one example. And I think the other thing that everybody should think about, or when you said what the
Is
non-working spouse should consider, is they're 100% in control of their spending. And so I know it sounds punitive to call it a budget, which is why I never call it a budget. I call it a spending plan because I think it's much more powerful. But you can consider your spending and your lifestyle and, reduce those costs too, if you're planning not to work, because your spousal support is only going to be a set amount of money each month.
definitely, but I think you bring up something too, is the splitting of the assets. Is even if there is stay-at-home spouses, there are still assets that each spouse gets, and I know that varies by state in how those are, I guess, community property or separate
Right,
property and all that. But that, I think that's the other part to think about, that it's not just spousal support, is that if you get certain assets, you can sell them,
right.
or
And
as
generate
you point out,
income.
manage them.
Yes, and generate income from your assets. And the one thing I point out to all my clients, actually, there's two things. Is the first thing is that your portfolio becomes your paycheck, right? So
Mhm.
you have to have your assets be income producing. That's why I'm really sometimes anti keeping the house, because real estate, unless it's an apartment building or something, your family home is very illiquid. And so one of the things in your divorce is you want income generating assets that
Mhm.
become income to you. The other thing is, it's frustrating because so many non-working spouses they stay at home. And I look at it as like climbing Mount Everest, is that, while your spouse is climbing Everest, they really can't reach the top without a good base camp. And that stay-at-home spouse is maintaining the base camp, right? And you can't climb Everest without that. So I specialize in late life divorces. So people that are 50 and older and 20 plus years married. And their selection of which assets they pick is critical because they have a shorter runway from which to generate income. And if they sell their marital home, a lot of people think, well, I'm going to keep it and then I'm just going to sell it in 5 or 10 years. Well, there's a lot of time a lurking capital gains tax impact for keeping the family home. Because unlike death, you don't get a step up in basis. You keep the basis that you purchased the house at. So sometimes there could be, in California, we know there's been massive amounts of home appreciation. There are people out there that have, $1 million, $1.2 million in capital gains that are sitting in their house. And when their spouse walks away and you've worked so hard in your divorce to keep your house, they walk away scot-free, not having to pay any of those taxes. And you, on the other hand, have to pay those capital gains taxes that were accumulated during the marriage.
Yeah, I'm just taking a note, like the capital gains in the home is, I think people overlook is what you're pointing out. And that can come through even in retirement plans, and how they're distributed. So, one of the things you mentioned is the term gray divorce. What is a gray divorce and why is it growing in the US?
So a gray divorce is what I also call a late life divorce. I don't know technically if their definition is the same as mine, but it is when you've been married, your kids are grown, they've flown the coop, and now you look at your partner and you're like, huh, yeah, you were good for a while, but I'm not, we don't connect the same way we did, right? And I think the reason it's on the rise, and I think the statistics are something like, for people 65 and older, it's increased like 60% or something from 2019. I don't have the exact figures, but it's increased some 50% or for people over 50, right? It's increased a lot. And I think, and again, I don't know the exact statistics, but I will say that a lot of the reasons is because women have entered the workforce and they are making substantially more money than in the past. And so they're able financially to separate from their spouse. And then the other thing is we're living longer. So, I mean, it is not, you know, incomprehensible to imagine that you could have not one long divorce, long marriage, but two. You could be married, 30 years while you're raising your kids and then have another 20-year marriage. That's 50 years of married life. And if you add to being 30 years old, you're 80. You could have 50 years in two marriages. So that's another reason for a late life divorce. People are like, I'm not happy here. I want to find a partner that, I'm more compatible with. And very few of my clients at the end of their divorce are thinking about a second marriage, let me tell you. But I'm just saying that there are, you can, leave your spouse at 60 and have another really good relationship for 20 or 30 more years. We're living to age, 90, 95, 100 now. So that's the
Yeah,
other reason for the growth.
definitely. Well, and as you point out, as people change, and it is different, when your kid flies the coop, is all of a sudden you're there with your spouse all the time. And
Mhm.
as you move into retirement, is you're really there with your spouse all the time, where maybe over 20 years, 30 years, you haven't spent much time with your spouse. And I think, we're definitely not going to talk about having a healthy marriage as it, but I think that is part of it to me, is that people haven't spent a lot of time with their spouse. And that all of a
No.
sudden, like you mentioned, there's an event where all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm spending more time with you and I'm not
Yep.
enjoying it that much.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and COVID, I think the COVID experience was a trial run for people. They got to practice like, oh, this is what retirement's going to look like. Oh, I don't know that I want that, because everybody was sheltering in place and lots of togetherness, a lot of togetherness. And so I think coming out of the COVID pandemic, people were like, huh, I don't think I want this anymore. So yes, I know my business. I mean, I started my business at the, beginning of COVID, so I've only seen it go up, but I've talked to other professionals in this space and they said, oh yeah, they've gotten much busier post-pandemic.
yeah, well, and I think as you point out, is part of it is society and women's role in it and the workforce, and that women are feeling like they have the power to go out
Mhm.
on their own. Where, I mean, we go back, what was it? And women couldn't even have their own credit card until what, the 1970s, I
Correct.
think, and sign mortgages and things like that. So to some degree, women, I think, had less ability, not necessarily that divorces are being driven by women, but
Mhm.
but that, things have changed where women have some power, and that has changed the game dramatically.
Definitely. Definitely.
So, let's talk a little bit about, you know, divorce is overwhelming just in and of itself, but why does the financial aspect become even more overwhelming, and why do people get so stuck in it?
That's a great question. I mean, I think some of it is we all have our roles in our marriage, right? And even though you might have graduated with an accounting degree, you might be, smart with money, but for whatever reason, the roles of managing the money, investing the money, all of that went with your spouse. You were busy with the kids, or you did all the club sports and the driving and the carpooling, et cetera, and you each had your roles. And then you're faced with a divorce, and all of a sudden you don't really even know what assets you have, where they're located, how much risk that your spouse might have had with your assets. I mean, I had a client that they had a beautiful house and they had a lot of toys and a ski cabin and all this stuff, but they were levered to the nines. They had so much debt. And it was almost like what I taught my kids at a young age. Just because you have it doesn't mean you own it. And you really see that in divorce. So all of a sudden, the my client is looking at her balance sheet. It's like there's no there there. There's nothing here that to divide because everything has been levered, and she had no idea. So, that's not necessarily a slam on the other spouse. Maybe the reason they had to go into debt is because, we make a lot of money here in the Bay Area, as an example, but our expenses are really high too. So I think there's even a term out there called Henrys, the name
Hmm.
Henry, high earners, not rich yet. And you definitely see it in places with the Bay Area where maybe some of the public schools aren't that good. And so you're sending your kids to private schools at $50,000 a year per child. And you're just spending and you're keeping up, and you're taking, credit out of your house, lines of credit and borrowing. And so it's really important that you understand, to your question, it's just really that you understand what you have before you divide it. In fact, there are 4 steps to property division. And I just want to point that out because you asked the question why it's so important. And what happens is there's 4 steps. The first step is identifying everything that you have. The second thing is characterizing what you have. How much is marital? How much is non-marital? And things like inheritance and gifts are non-marital. So they don't even get divided. You just get them. Then there's the valuation of all of those assets and debts, and then you divide. And what so often happens is couples sit down, they decide that they're going to get divorced. The first thing that happens is the person asking for the divorce falls over themselves to show you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Don't you worry. I'm going to take care of you. You're going to be okay. So they say, hey, I'm out, but you're going to be okay. Well, that's not really comforting in that moment. And so when you look at everything and you have to divide. So the first thing they do is you're going to be okay because I'm dividing the assets this way. Well, meanwhile, they're dividing gifts, they're dividing inheritance, they're dividing all these things that shouldn't even be divided. And so then you have to claw back and you have to walk backwards from what you said. And it's really important that the person being asked of the divorce understands what's rightfully theirs. Because again, I've had clients that have come to me with this balance sheet that I call them husband, that their husband put together. And a big portion of it is their own inheritance that doesn't even get divided. So I really encourage everybody who's going through a divorce to just stop, think about those 4 steps, and don't even think about division yet. You have a lot of work to do before you decide how you're going to divide your assets. And I always say to my clients that we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, to listen and to get information before you speak about what it is you're going to take in your divorce. And I'm telling you, the 2 ears and 1 mouth is so important in divorce, especially as you're mediating or talking with your attorneys, especially talking with your ex-spouse.
Yeah, well, I think you hit on something super important. As one is to understand how the process works before you agree to anything. And that's
Mhm.
just a great rule when it comes to money or life in general, to take a deep breath and to understand whatever it is that you're doing, and especially in this case, divorce. But I think you said something also that's critically important, not just for divorce, but that the odds are that most women are going to be solo at some point, mostly because of widowhood. And if you become a widow and you don't know how the money was handled, it's going to be really difficult to take control of the financial life when you haven't been part of what's going on. So, one of the things that I recommend to people is that they have family financial meetings. And whether
Great idea.
that's, whether it's with adult children, if you're an aging parent. And in the case of Great Divorce, I did an episode on this that some people may have listened to, with Chris Hay, where we talked about that after age 60, you start to cognitively decline, no
Mm,
matter who you are, that everybody does. It's a very gradual decline, but that you want to know these things. You want to maybe bring adult kids into the conversation, but you want to know ahead of time. So, like you said, is that everybody has their roles. Now, in our marriage, I handle most of our finances. I'm the money person, so it's the natural thing
yes.
for me to do. I've been the treasurer for, foundation, I handle money. So
Yes. Yes.
it's my role, but I work to make sure that my wife understands every major financial decision, that we talk about, where our assets are kept, what my strategy is, make sure she's comfortable with the strategy. And I think that that's something that's really important. And I do it out of love, because if something happens to me, she needs to know. She needs to know who to call, what's going on, what
Yes.
I'm thinking. And like you said, with debt is debt can get really out of control, but sometimes debt is not always bad. And in
Correct.
certain
That's true.
cases, like, let's take low mortgages, for instance. If you have a substantial mortgage on your house, but you're only paying 3% interest on the mortgage, that's not bad debt. Now,
No, there's some
this
leveraging
is
there
not
you could do.
advice. Yeah, there's leveraging, and we're definitely not going to get into this. And this is not
Right.
advice on whether to take debt out or not, but to recognize, like you said, is that there are mitigating circumstances. But if you haven't communicated that, it can come as a surprise to the other spouse. And that can make a divorce, I would imagine, a little more hot when somebody goes, "Oh my God, you have all these huge debts. You're in hock," and it's like, Okay, I don't know if anybody uses that term in Hawk anymore,
Yeah.
but you know,
I've heard it.
you know,
But you're
so
right.
so I think communication is key. Whether or not you're planning to get divorced, is that it's something that anybody in a marriage can do, but that I think it's especially important for women to do because women traditionally let the man invest and then, they become solo,
Mhm.
either through widowhood or divorce. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And then they end up, like you said, is making decisions that are not the most advantageous for them because of course everybody looks at the house. The house is, the most significant asset that most Americans have. And so as a spouse, somebody says, okay, well, you get the house, they're like, oh my gosh, I won the lottery, I get the biggest asset.
Yeah, yeah. It's not necessarily a good thing because it's so illiquid. And a lot of people have great ideas about turning it into an ADU and, you know, putting a guest house in and all these things. And it's like, have you talked to a contractor? Do you have any idea that that's running between $300,000 and $400,000 to do that work? And then you're parting with those, portfolio assets to create more illiquid, well, it actually becomes liquid in a case of an ADU, but you're parting with other assets, so getting some of those bids and as you said, we live longer and there's the case of widowhood. We talked a little bit before the show about long-term care. And that's one of the things that really hits a gray divorce worse than a regular divorce. And that is that in a long-term marriage, you're kind of implicitly each other's caregivers, right? It's just a given that you're gonna take care of each other as you age. And you're talking about cognitive decline at age 60. I'm jumping ahead 20 years. So let's say that's 10 years of kind of caregiving for each other minimally, but then there's long-term care, with the final 3 to 5 years, that's the most expensive time, whether you're in a facility or you're having home caregivers. And so you might have in your financial plan and in your investments, and even as a couple, you might have bought long-term care policies, but that is for maybe a 3 to 5 year period. But now that you're living alone after divorce, your period may be much longer, like another 5 or 10 years, starting at age, let's say 85 or something. You might have 5 years before you thought about your long-term care policy, right? And then there's the age in place situation. Some of these homes in San Francisco and Presidio Heights, they're beautiful, they're worth a lot of money. That's where they raise the kids. Like, I want that house. Well, it's 4 stories high. There's 4 sets of stairs. Do you have a bathroom with the shower on the main level? Like, how are you going to age in place in that home? And if you're not going to age in place, then you're going to sell it with that, huge capital gains hit in there that you weren't thinking about. So there's all these things to think about in a great divorce. And one of them is aging in place and being able to take care of yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue is aging in place. And for people watching and listening, there's a recent episode I did with Carol Chang where we talk just specifically about aging in place and creating an aging plan well before you think you're going to need
Yes.
it. So
Before life
don't
happens.
exactly before life
Mhm,
happens.
mhm.
So, before we get into the final questions, there's just one other ones is, are there any other practical steps someone can take financially before or during a divorce that you'd recommend?
Yes. The big one is access to liquidity. So oftentimes, you're just going to have a lot of divorce expenses if you hire a financial professional for your divorce, like me, or your own attorney, or your mediator. Sometimes you need extra therapy as you go through it. I mean, your expenses are going to rocket. And as I said earlier, I think you need to think about the process as an investment in yourself. It's like an MBA program for yourself because you're having to play catch up in with your finances and taking all of this on yourself. And so you're going to incur a lot of expenses. Well, if you don't have a credit card in your own name, as an example, a lot of people think they have credit, but really they're just authorized users on their spouse's card. And so they don't have access. And one of the things that can quickly happen is they shut down all those extra cards and you don't have access to funds. So that's critical. And again, a lot of people think they have a lot of money, but in that checking account is only, a couple $1,000s. And meanwhile, your divorce attorney is asking for a $10,000 retainer. So, okay, you then go to your Schwab account thinking that that's where you have cash, but really those are a bunch of stocks that have unrealized capital gains in them. And then you're going to have to take out 1.3% of what you need because you have to pay the tax man. So so when you said the first, one of the practical things somebody can do before they get divorced is make sure they have liquidity. That to me, that is the most important thing. The other thing is knowing your expenses inside and out, backwards and forward. So a lot of times people think, oh, they just look at their credit card bill and they say, oh, my credit card bill is usually $10,000 a month. So that's my expenses. Well, don't forget your car registrations are only paid once a year. Your insurance policies are paid once a year. Those are big things that you think about. But then when it comes to gifts, well, there's birthdays and Christmas, of course, Hanukkah, of course, but then think about all the hostess gifts, the teacher gifts, the gardener, this gifts, and those expenses can just skyrocket. I mean, they already exist, but you're not seeing them monthly on that credit card statement, as an example. So before anybody contemplates divorce, sit down. I give the California divorce forms shows like 13 line items for expenses. And my spreadsheet that I give to my clients has some 160 line items, 160 wow. Compared to 13. So I contemplate the dog biscuits, the dog grooming, every little expense is in my spreadsheet. And you have to understand, if you're about to get divorced, you have to understand how much it costs to be you, how much it costs to be you, because that's what you have to support post-divorce.
Yeah, I love that because there are sort of they're not quite invisible costs because they're there, but they're costs like you talk about that we don't really see because they happen every once in a while, or
Correct.
They're just deducted maybe from the bank account or something like that.
Yeah, auto pay and things like that.
Yeah, so one quick question that comes to mind is, so like, let's say you have a joint bank account. Once divorce has been filed, I know, I would imagine legally somebody can't drain the bank account, but how can somebody protect themselves from something like that happening?
Well, I always say nobody really ever wakes up one morning and says, oh, I think I'm going to get divorced today. I'm going to walk downstairs and ask for a divorce. It's usually a long process when you're deciding to get divorced. So early on, I talk to my clients about, making sure they have just access to those funds, whether or not they squirrel away some extra cash with an ATM. Let's say they're doing $100 withdrawals, you up it to 150 or 180. I mean, those are small amounts, but over a period of time, it can help. Or you're just straight up front and you say, look, this is going to cost us each 50 grand for our lawyers and our divorce professionals. Let's each take $50,000 from our account and separate it equally, and we each have an account and use it for our divorce expenses, and then it's equal, and you've set it aside. And you can do that early on too. I also tell my clients, like, if they've never even talked to their husband yet or husband that they're going to get a divorce, I say try to go and at least establish a new credit card at Athleta or Nordstrom. If you're shopping, just get one of those cards that they don't really, aren't hard to open. They look at your joint income. You're still married, so you have access to joint income. And I don't mean to imply that it's always the wife. I have plenty of male clients that are the non-high earning spouse, but you need a credit card in your own name. So ahead of time, just open up a card or two at those, you have to disclose everything. So you're not hiding it. At the end of the day, you're going to disclose, I have a new athletic card and I have a new Nordstrom card. You have to disclose it. But by that time, it's already done. You have access to it and you've hopefully paid for your lawyer's retainer or something from those accounts. So I hope that
That's
answers the question.
yeah.
It's a little tricky.
Well, but that's good advice anyway, is that each spouse should be, I guess, the lead user on a credit card account for a number of reasons. Also, again, widowhood comes to mind is
Hmm.
because the other spouse won't have a credit record.
Hmm.
If they
Oh,
haven't had a credit
yes.
card, is, like in our marriage, is my wife is the primary person on some of our utility accounts, on
Hmm.
a couple of the credit card accounts. So, our trust owns, some of our assets so that if something should happen to me, she's already got her own credit score, everything else. Actually, she out earns me, so she wouldn't have a problem anyway.
Right. Tony, that's funny.
But, but there is that. But aside from that, it's just good practice that each spouse should have some utilities in their name, that they should have credit cards in their name, as you point out, because somebody could, if and just in the heat of the moment, that maybe they're not a bad person, they don't have ill intent, but they're ticked off in the heat of the
Hmm.
moment, and they take off the authorized users off of the credit cards, and then
Hmm.
it's hard to undo as you're going through the
Yeah,
process.
they're prevented from closing accounts per se, but they can take off an authorized user and the account is still in their name. They didn't close it. It's still there, but they eliminated. And a lot of times that's just, lots of nastiness, like, changing passwords. And all of a sudden, a person who had access to her accounts knew how much money she had, has no access, no visibility. And earlier, when I started this business, we could go in and look at things. And now with two-factor authentication,
Oh
they
yeah.
know that you've even looked at the account. They know you've even opened up an account. So sometimes I'll ask, what's this account? I see this account. Well, it's an account that they had. It might be 10 or 15 years old, and all of a sudden she's trying to go in and look at it. Ping, ping, ping. He gets notice that, she's looking at an account, and that's okay. But then you got to be ready to explain it and all of that. So that, a lot of that access. So it's important that if you're really planning a divorce, you start thinking about your access to accounts, how you're going to find out balances. Do you have access to tax returns? Because if you hire a CDFA like me or some other divorce financial person, they're going to want to look at your income, look at your tax returns, and you need access to those things.
Well, you just made me think about something that, 2FA, again, I'm also thinking in terms of widows and widowers. If something happens to one spouse, you need access to their device to do
Hmm.
2FA. And that's a huge problem that I don't think we've addressed just overall in planning.
No.
'Cause 2FA is great for security,
Hmm.
but it raises
Hmm.
that issue is like, okay, well, your spouse passes away. If you don't have your spouse's access to your spouse's device, you can't authenticate on these accounts and it becomes challenging. But it's
And
time
don't
to,
even,
oh,
oh, go ahead. I was just gonna,
no, no,
I
go,
said
go.
you can't even rely on talking on the phone and saying, my husband just died and I need access. Like they won't even talk to you. They just, I need a copy of the death certificate. And that takes 6 weeks to get, or 3 weeks or 5 weeks or how many weeks. And so you can't even get into the account. And there's no nice person on the other end to say, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me help you with that. That just doesn't happen anymore. It's really key for widows, unfortunately.
Yeah, and AI just isn't there yet. So let's wrap up with what I call the Get Ready Hot Take Trio. These are three just super quick take questions that I ask all my guests. The first one is, what is one myth that you're trying to break about divorce and money?
That people get half the number of years married in spousal support. That's one myth that I'm just talking till I'm blue in the face. That is a myth. It is not fact. Does not exist. So that is my one myth that I try to break.
Yeah, and that's great. And when it comes to planning, I think that's a super important tip for people to be thinking about, with all the other things you talked about. So, let's get out the time machine for a minute. Is if you could go back in time, what would you tell your younger self about being prepared to navigate life's transitions?
I would tell myself deep breaths for one. I would tell myself that more is in my control than out of my control. And for the things that are out of my control, that back to the deep breaths. So, I mean, that is just one thing I've learned is that, you know, I have a lot of control over a lot of things, but the things that I don't have control over, I'll get there or I'll do deep breaths, or now the big thing is meditation and yoga. But there's always tools. There are always tools available in a toolbox. You just need to, know that they're there, that they exist to help you out.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful advice is just take a deep breath, not only before a life transition, but just all the time before you make any decision. It's always
Mhm.
good just to think, as we've talked a lot on the show about frauds and scams. And that's one of the things that frauds and scammers do is they apply time pressure because they
Mhm.
know that people will make poor decisions when they don't take a deep breath.
That's
So
that's
that's
true. And trusting your gut too. Like more than you think um, before life's transitions. I mean, trust your gut. I mean, you have your friends and your family that truly have your best interest in mind, but at the end of the day, you're the one that's going to have to deal with any of the consequences from your decision making. So you to trust your gut. Try to arm yourself with the information to help with that, but definitely trust yourself. Because I ask everybody in the divorce, what is your idea of success in this process? What would be a successful outcome to you? And then use that as your guiding light in the process.
I love that. Yeah, I'm just making a note because I want to make sure I get that into the show notes.
Oh,
So to wrap up, the final question is, what is your top tip to change the way we think about money and divorce?
oh, yeah. So I guess my top tip about thinking about divorce, money and divorce is try not to think of it as a big war and a battle. Think about it as keeping money in the family. Like the decisions you make about the assets that you take, the spousal support you want, but they affect your post-divorce life. But at the end of the day, try to keep the money in the family, not a bunch of forensic accountants, as an example, that you have to pay $20,000 to show a $2,000 discrepancy in something. And believe me, I've had that happen. Or, just to really try to keep the money in the family, just spend what it takes to arm you with information, but not to win every little last battle for the money. Because again, it's not so much about the money that you're getting, but how you spend that money. And that is 100% in your control. Your spending is 100% in your control. So if you think about acquiring wealth, and you know this better than I do, Tony, but you can, earn money or spend less. You can earn more or spend less. And it's just two sides of the equation. And people forget all about the spending less. They think instead all about give me more, I need more. And so
Yeah,
that's kind of a takeaway.
well, that's a wonderful tip. And you mentioned this pre-show is, the example of somebody spending tens of thousands of dollars to find an account that has a $2,500 balance.
Mhm.
So that's, right there. I think that's a wonderful example of what you've been talking about. So, Chris, where can people learn more about you, DIVEE Financial, and the resources that you have available?
Yes. So my website is diveefi.com, capital DIV double EFI.com. And I am on LinkedIn as well, under Chris Olofson. And I'm not on social media yet, but they can find me on my website. at divify.com.
Awesome. Awesome. And for everybody watching and listening, if you have access to the show notes, there will be a link to Chris's website as well as to her LinkedIn profile so you can get in touch with her. Chris, thanks for joining us today on Get Ready Before Life Happens.
Thank you, Tony. It was a good time.
Yeah, thank you for all your insights. And thank you, everyone, as always, for tuning in to this episode of Get Ready Before Life Happens. If you learned something today to change the way you think about money and divorce, please be sure to subscribe and to share it with a friend. You can also go to my website at tonystewart.com to join the Get Ready movement and get access to all of my free resources. Until next time, let's change the way we think about money.